factors that are you can't change. A lot of times when people go out especially in the fall, they might be looking at the riparian areas to see if they can shake a big buck out, or they may be trying to find some of these rather scarce bob whites. They're hard to find anymore. But as we get to looking at the riparian areas, we also need to remember that raindrops fall over a wide area, not just in riparian areas. And there was a wise Texan who once said, saving the water and the soil must start where the first raindrop falls. Now, Lyndon Johnson was also our 36th president. He was a Texan, a rancher. The family ranch is still down in outside of Johnson City. It's a national park or national recreational area now. You can go to it and see it. When we get to looking at the plants and the vegetation, everything about the outdoors, you have to ask, do you love, respect, and have admiration for the land? This rancher I was working with out in Abilene, he certainly did. He was looking at the seeds of this Leavenworth Oringo plant. And it's kind of interesting because in February, when most of these seeds start falling on the ground, and when bobwhite quail and other seed-eating birds they run out of many seeds to eat, these start falling, and we'll see them in the quail crops in hunting season. And these seeds are always interesting because they look like little dinosaur scales on the back of those seeds. And how well do you understand your land? This is a big part about what we try to work with landowners to understand, how to read the land, how to be able to understand what you're seeing. And in the background, we can see some dead cedars that had been dozed. And this person is looking, he's finding new plants that he hadn't seen before. He's gaining an understanding of the land that is the result of what happened after the brush clearing. And we've got our first quiz question, and I'll give you the answer since it's a little hard to do the chat. It takes time. So what you see the raindrops in this photo. What happens when rainfall hits the ground? There's two things that can happen. One, the water either soaks in if it lands on good grass, or if it lands on bare soil, it will run off. And even on this kind of soil, it'll soak in maybe just a 1 inch of rain. Maybe the first quarter inch will soak in and 3/4 of an inch runs off. But it takes soil with it. We'll talk about that. There is this photo right here is a fence line contrast photo. You're looking right down the fence line between two property owners. And this fence is just a regular sheep and goat fence, 48-inch net wire. It's not a deer-proof fence. But if you look on either side of the fence, it might be a little blue stem proof fence because we don't see any over here. Or could it be grazing management that's the cause of that problem? If we look at a raindrop when it hits the ground, bare soil, and there's water, a sheen of water on the surface of the soil, that raindrop explodes like a bomb. And it's picking up with the water fragments, particles of silt and clay, and even sometimes the larger sand grains, and picks them up and puts them in suspension in the water, and they can be floated away. How much rain does it take to really cause a problem, though? Look at a gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. 1 acre inch of water, which is an inch deep water over an acre, or about the size of a football field, is 27,000 gallons in an acre inch. Multiply that out, that's 226,000 pounds, or 113 tons of weight hitting the soil. So when a raindrop falls over here and it lands in this little blue stem and starts sliding down the stem, it's going to probably have to have the help of 2 or 3 more raindrops following it to push it on down. It'll get down to the leaves, get down into this old organic material, the decaying leaves of previous years, and eventually it'll get down to the soil and it'll soak in, and very little runs off. And the water that soaks in is going into our soil profile. Whereas over here, where this grass is a 1/2 inch to no more than 1 inch tall, a raindrop that falls, it has a short course to hit soil and get this explosion happening. And then we start moving water off the land downstream toward our creeks and riparian areas. And that's how these uplands can contribute water and sediment. Water will run off of this eventually, but it'll take a lot longer. It'll happen fast here. And we're also losing topsoil, the most valuable soil that we have. So we've got a feature here. It's a topographic map, and we've got a dashed line that is going around the boundary of this area. All of the water that collects and runs down exits this topographic feature right here. So that would be the place to put a dam if you wanted to build a lake. But that's not what we're after here. In our world, we think of this as a watershed. All of the water that falls inside sheds this way. All the water that falls over here sheds outside that way. But in New Zealand, Australia, they're looking at this a little bit different. They're thinking of it more as a water catchment, and that they're wanting to catch and hold the raindrops that fall on the land because it grows more vegetation, grows more crops. And when I worked out in Snyder, there was an old cotton farmer who was also a board member of the Soil and Water Conservation District. And I was visiting with him out on his place, and he was proud of it. And he said, I keep my terraces plowed up, and I keep my waterways in good shape, and I can handle, a 2 or 3 inch rain, and nothing runs off. Everything stays on my land. I want to capture all the water I can that falls so it'll make my crops grow. And he looked up the hill, up the way his neighbors, and he said, and I'll take all the water that my uphill neighbors will send my way. He could make use of it. He was a water catchment farmer. But we still have landowners. Another fence line contrast photo between 2 different landowners. One still thinking of the land as a watershed, and one realizing that, if I maybe cut back on the animal stocking rate, I can save a little water because it will soak in. Now I've got more grass on the ground, on the surface, and it will soak into the soil and grow more grass, and I can actually grow more pounds of beef by treating the land as a water catchment and not overgrazing. Now, when we look at a creek, there's 2 corkscrews, water paths. And in a straight segment, these 2 corkscrews, one going clockwise, one going counterclockwise, but they're going like this, right down the middle of that creek. And in the straight segments, you can actually see an upwell in the water. It's kind of like being on a football field where the middle of the field is higher and it slopes down to the sidelines. Well, that's what's happening out there in the water. When it comes to a bend in the creek, this outer corkscrew assumes dominance, and both corkscrews then are turning in this clockwise manner against that bank, and they're cutting. And like what you see right here, they're cutting this soil out of that bank right there. That soil will be carried by the water downstream, and then on the inside of the next bend, that water will be deposited into a point bar. Now, this point bar here, the soil from it came from a outside bend way up here, somewhere off the drawing. But that's how this water and sediment is transported. And for a creek, that's really all that creek does, is transport water and sediment. And it tries to do it as efficiently and neatly as it can. Now, this is a balance beam from a gentleman named Emery Lane. He was a hydrologist back in the middle 1900s, came up with this beam as a way to show the relationship between water and sediment. So if we have water on one side, soil, rocks, sediment, either sediment that washes in from the uplands or comes out of the banks of the creek is on the other side of this balance beam. Let's say that we get a massive amount of rain like we did back in 2015 and 16, and all of that water is in our creeks. This water is going to enlarge, and this balance beam is going to be dipping down right here. What's that going to do to this arrow? It's going to swing it over to the degradation or erosion side of the balance beam, and that creates a problem. Now, if there's something happening like sometimes in urban areas or sometimes out in rural areas with overgrazing, and maybe a gravel mine gets started upstream, or in urban areas, a new subdivision is built, lots of construction, maybe there's an excess amount of sediment washes into the creek with one of those high rain events. Now this balance bar is going to go over to the aggradation, or it's going to aggrade or build in. It's going to gain sediment. So it's going to build up those point bars, maybe some midstream bars, and it's adding soil and sediment. It may not can carry it all. Let's look at this little simple drawing here. Steve Nelly, my counterpart in San Angelo, drew this up several years ago and shared it, and we're using it tonight. So we've got a hill on either side and a valley in between. And this valley is 10,000 feet long in a straight line. Now, the elevation at the top of the hill is 1,600 feet. And even though it looks like it's going uphill, this is actually 100 foot lower. So this is an elevation of 1,500 feet. So water is going this way. If the creek ran as straight as the valley is, then that would be a creek length of 10,000 feet and a valley length of, well, it's actually back up. We have 100 foot of elevation drop in 10,000 feet of length. That's what I should have been saying. And that gives us a gradient of 1%, which is very fast. That's fast water for any creeks in Texas. So what that creek is sensing is that it needs to slow down. It can't, it's creating too much flow. And so it will begin to meander and work back and forth, zigzagging across that channel, that valley. And now it's added 4,000 feet. So it's got 14,000 feet, still has 100 foot of fall. And now the grade is 0.7%. That's still fast water. So the creek will continue that meandering. And you see this down in the lower elevation, lower end of all the rivers. The Mississippi River is probably the most famous one that meanders back and forth like this when it exits into the Gulf of Mexico. But now we've got a channel length of 25,000 feet, and that creates a gradient of 0.4%, which is about the slope of the creeks in the Edwards Plateau, the hill country area of Texas. And now the creek is able to slow down and transport sediment and water. But if the creek senses that maybe something has changed upstream and there's less water coming down, maybe better grazing management on the ranches upstream, and it needs to straighten the creek out, it needs to gain or shorten the slope, it'll come along and cut across right here. And this will be creating an oxbow. You probably heard and seen of oxbow lakes. Well, that's what happened. The creek cut across, steepened the grade, and tried to increase the amount of water and sediment that was leaving down that valley. So in that case, if it needs to strengthen it, cut across right here, it's going to be steepening. So this bar would actually move out. Whoops, let me move back. You would actually move this bar to the right, and that would show the creek steepening, and that would still balance out with the water and the sediment. So here's a simple drawing of a creek. Here's the channel. Here's the base flow. Now all of this information that we're giving applies to perennial creeks and seasonal creeks. The ephemeral creeks that only flow as a result of snowmelt or rainfall are not in contact with a water table, and so this doesn't apply. But any creek that has a water table under it, this will work. So here's the base flow. That's what the creek flows year round on a perennial creek. Here's bank full. This is when it's just about to spill out onto the floodplain. And this should happen on a 1 to 2 year average. You should have a bank full event about every year and a half. That's not bad. It's a good thing. It's not harmful. Then as we get a little more runoff or more rain, the creek will get out onto the active floodplain. And that's normal. That's natural. Creeks do flood. It's bad if it gets into your house, but it's a good thing for a creek because it feeds the creek. It feeds nutrients. Out here on the floodplain, it brings in broken bits of riparian plants that are adapted to growing now in moist mud. They'll take root again and begin to grow. Here in the middle of the channel, we have fast water, high velocity water. But out here on the floodplain, because there's vegetation out here, there's trees and stumps and rocks, this will slow down the water, and we call it low velocity water. That energy, when you scrub that water and slow it down, it causes sediment to drop out. Just like you see in a bar ditch, when water hits the culvert, it slows down, it drops sediment out in front of that culvert. Well, that's what's happening out here on the floodplain. And that's natural. We want to see that because that makes the floodplain bigger and deeper and more able to hold water. So in essence, the floodplains dissipate the energy and they trap sediment out here on the banks of the floodplain. And that's what we're seeing here. As this gains another half a foot or so of water, it's going to spill out onto the floodplain. You can see some previous organic materials, even logs, get deposited out here. Sediment that you can't see unless you're out there right after a flood, because within a month or two, it's starting to be incorporated into the floodplain and vegetation's covering up that fresh sediment. So here's that creek at base flow with the associated water table. When we get into the summer and most other creeks are drying up, if your creek still has water in it, that's because there's a water table underneath the creek giving up water to the creek. So that's what prolongs the flow of a creek and makes it a perennial creek. If it's a seasonal creek, these normally flow in our part of the world during the wintertime when the trees are not using the water. So it flows in the winter, early spring, and then during the summer, when the trees are leafed out, the creek will go dry. So when we have a flood event and water gets out on the floodplain, that water goes back into the soil, gets down into our water table, and it recharges the water table. Now that prolongs base flow, and that's the give and take that the creek and the water table, the riparian sponge, which is what this is also called, that's what happens. So the water is given to the water table, and then the water is given back to the creek. Flooding recharges the water table. But sometimes, and this happens a lot in urban areas, it happens in rural areas as well, something changes upstream. Overgrazing happens, a gravel pit goes in, subdivision is built, usually causing excessive amounts of water to come into the creek. And the creek will begin to downcut. And it downcuts and downcuts more, and then it reaches a point where it doesn't go any deeper, but it goes wide. It widens out. And then eventually it reaches a point where it's somewhat in equilibrium again with what it can handle, and it'll stabilize. But it's a nasty looking mess when this is happening, and really you can't stop it without spending a lot of money. It's just going to happen. And what we wind up with is now our creek channel is here, all of this, and it used to be right there. So all of the water that's coming down this creek has enlarged the channel, made it a lot bigger, and it's not going to be the same creek probably ever again. And this is what one can look like out in a rural area. Notice the difference. Here's the middle of the creek right here. But on this side, there's still trees and shrubs and grasses and riparian vegetation somewhat. And there's still some stability. But look over here. Back years ago, you can see they pushed the trees here and planted Bermuda grass. And more than likely, they pushed the trees all the way up to the edge of the creek, maybe leaving one row of trees on the edge that they couldn't get to. Then they planted Bermuda grass. But Bermuda grass, the roots cannot withstand the energy of this flood water. And so the creek begins to wash. And it's washing faster on this side than it is over here with the wooded vegetation still present. But this is that downcutting and widening stage. And like I said, it's a nasty looking creek when it's like this. You're not going to be able to put riprap of rocks down here in the bottom, that's not going to stop it. It's going to just wash that on down. So here's that creek with our base flow and our associated water table. When the creek down cuts, what happens to the water table? It's losing ground. It's going down because there's no longer enough water up here to keep the water table that full. So down cutting drains the water table. And the energy that was in the creek up high is now down here. And we can't get water out onto the floodplain anymore. This is contributing all that energy. Even if we had twice this much water, all that energy is still down here in the channel. It hasn't gotten out on the floodplain. So that's contributing to the down cutting. But it also contributes to a death of many of the riparian plants that are rooted up here on top. And previously their roots were going down and they were in the water table. But now the water table is so far down that those plants are going to just die. So here's a wash in Bell County. It had a natural creek right over here, and they went in and built something right here to drain water a different direction for some reason. I don't remember the story. But look at the erosion that's happened. This dirt clod right here is about the size of a refrigerator. But look at the grass, how short it is. There's no riparian vegetation. There's no woody plants to hold the soil. So man created this problem by clearing too much of the brush and creating this wash and trying to make the creek go where it didn't want to go. Here's a head cut. And this is one, you might call it a waterfall, and it looks kind of pretty. But what it's doing is it's marching up that watershed, up this creek. And as water falls over, it erodes the soil underneath and it caves in and just keeps moving. And it will walk its way up this creek until it hits something hard. Nature provides ledge rock, boulders the size of an automobile, or rocks the size of bushel baskets that can slow that down. The only thing that man can provide that'll slow it down is a concrete embedded, like a bridge or some type of foundation that can hopefully slow that down. But look at what the creek goes from this to this, and it's down cutting and widening. Here's a small one, a small head cut. Look at the creek up here. It's very, it's got a trapezoidal shape. It's not a bad creek. It's flowing well, but when it comes down here, something happened downstream that created what's called a nick point. It's a weakness that allows a head cut to form, and the water now, instead of being 3 feet wide and 1.5 feet deep, well, it's 4 foot deep and 8 foot wide and continuing to widen. Even though this vegetation is awful good, it's still got a hard way to stop this erosion. That's why protecting our creeks before we have a problem is a whole lot better and easier and cheaper than trying to fix them after the problem happens. Some of our creeks have rock bottoms in them. And when we have a normal creek like this, there's base flow, bank full flow. Here's now the flood flow out on the floodplains. There's the water table perched above the rock layer. Water can't seep through the rock, so it's perched above the water table or above the rocks. And the creek gives water back to the water table, just like it did with that other creek. And it enlarges the riparian sponge. And throughout the year, the riparian sponge gives water back to the creek, sustaining base flow. And here's a riparian sponge, active floodplain, you might call it, right down here. If we come over here and dig a hole down to this elevation right here, water will seep in because there's water all under the ground right there. But that's a good vegetation. It's not overgrazed. Good amount of stability in this little creek right here. So when we get problems with overgrazing or construction or whatever happens upstream that creates excessive flow, these creeks will erode too, but they can't down cut any deeper than the rock layer. then they start widening. And eventually they reach equilibrium. Here's our depleted water riparian sponge on either side. This is what we used to have as a creek. Now we've got this whole wide, flat channel. This is how much soil has been lost, and it's going to be hard to get it back. So channel widening reduced the riparian sponge. And this is what it would look like on a rock bottom creek. Notice right here, it's eroded the floodplain completely away. We're into the upland section right here. A little bit of the old floodplain right here still shown. But this creek has gotten so wide and shallow that it can no longer transport these larger fist-sized rocks on down the creek. And we've got a mid-channel bar right here of rock, and that's not good. But if we remove the hindrance, change what caused the problem, we can do some recovery of these creeks. And as we look at base flow on this overly widened creek now, after it washed down to the rock bottom, there's base flow, there's the bank full flow, it can't get out on the floodplain, and we wind up with very shallow water. And that shallow water cannot transport the sediment. And we wind up with situations like this. This is the Nueces River in Southwest Texas. This water is probably only 2 or 3 inches deep back here. It's an inch deep right here, and it can't transport anything but the finest materials, sands and silts and clays. It's not able to transport the rocks or cobbles. And under a flood flow event, though, you do see rocks piled up over here. It almost looks like lava flowing. That's from the high flow event. And then when the flood's over and we get back to a normal transport of water and sediment, this creek can't transport it because it's too wide and too shallow. But if we go through and try to help the creeks to fix themselves over time, low flow flood events will start depositing a little bit of sediment on either side. This should be brown instead of blue. So this is sediment that gets deposited. And the next time it rains, maybe 6 or 8 months from now, another bit of sediment gets deposited. And another rain event deposits more sediment. Now, if we have a high flow, really big flood, this will get washed away and we may have to start over. But the creek will attempt to heal itself. And what it's going to do is try to rebuild a new creek channel down in this new life that it has, this new deepened creek. So what we used to have was that shape. Now we have this shape, and this is all sediment. And we have rebuilt the water table, but it's down low. It's charging or giving water back to the creek here and no longer up here because that's up in air. And now the riparian vegetation that was up here is no longer alive, but the riparian vegetation that's down here is alive. And we'll talk about the plants that can stand going from wet to dry and survive, the facultative plants. We'll talk about those. They're not bad. So here's a picture. This is down in Junction area. I think this is called Bull Creek. But notice we've got some steep banks. This is a outside bend of the creek. So it was eroding and maybe it's still eroding right there. But we've started getting, like you see right here, we're getting a little bit of deposition of the sediment. We're getting vegetation taking root, helping to slow that floodwater and capture sediment and enlarge this area. So that's what it starts with. And eventually, when it gets to be this shape right here, here's our channel rebuilt right here. And here's our new floodplain on either side of the channel that you see right here. Now, this used to be the floodplain, but now it's an abandoned floodplain. And this is our active floodplain down here. And the creek is back in a healthy state of equilibrium. It's just at a lower elevation than it used to be. And on these rock bottom creeks, they will heal up the same way. And sometimes they're, because this water is pretty flashy on these rock bottom creeks, It gets washed out quite frequently before it can rebuild and restabilize. But they will eventually reform a new channel. And again, whatever caused the problem has got to be remedied upstream to slow the water down and not have this excessive amounts of water going down the creek. And here's an example of one of the rock bottom creeks. Look at this sediment, and we've got switchgrass and other plants growing on it. And that's helping to hold the sediment from the next flood event and to enlarge this area and make that channel a little smaller. It's going to narrow up the channel and it'll be a healthy creek again. Here's a creek in the hill country. Notice that again, it's washed all the way to the uplands. If we change the problem, and look at the problem, look at the grass over here on the side, how short it is. Whether the grazing is by animals or it's by lawnmowers cutting it that short, that's a hindrance to this creek. It's limiting this creek in restoring itself. But if we can fix up the grazing, the creek will pick a path for the channel, and then it will start depositing that sediment, and it will reform the channel down here at that lower elevation. So it can fix itself if we give it time and we remove the problem that caused it to degrade in the first place. There's a full one-day course on riparian areas, and they define proper functioning condition as being a properly functioning riparian area will have adequate vegetation, landform, or large logs. Landform would be shelf rock, boulders. Large logs are just that, dead trees that have fallen in and become incorporated into the sediment of the creek. And all of this, and we're going to concentrate on the vegetation though, the rest of this talk. So this will dissipate the energy of the floodwater, slow it down, reduce but not totally eliminate erosion, because erosion is natural, and it will stabilize the banks. We're talking vegetation will stabilize those banks, trapping sediment, developing the floodplains, enlarging the floodplains, providing floodwater retention in those floodplains, which provides groundwater recharge. And that puts water back into our riparian sponge. So let's talk about some of the different types of riparian plants. If we were doing this live in front of a crowd, I'd look out across the audience and I could see the ranchers in the crowd because they'd have their straw hats on right now. And I'd ask them, what of these plant types, what types do you think are most important to you? Well, they're going to say grasses. And you look around the room, see who's got a camo baseball cap on, and you ask them, and they're the wildlife managers, and they're going to say, we're managing for forbs, shrubs, and trees. And they're correct. Both are correct. Well, what about these cats right here, the sedges and rushes? Who's managing for them? Well, we need to be in the riparian areas because those are the best adapted plants for stabilizing these riparian areas. It takes some of all of it, but those are the ones that can stand the erosion, and their roots are adapted for growing in wet conditions, and they do the best job. There's two different groups that we need to talk about of riparian plants. You need to understand the difference between colonizers and stabilizers. And among the stabilizers, we have both herbaceous, grassy type. This could be grasses, sedges, or rushes. And we have woody stabilizers, trees and shrubs. So the colonizers are the first plants to come out and show a little bit of green on that fresh deposited soil or gravel or sandbars. The first plant that comes in is going to be a colonizer. And they spread by stolons or rhizomes, sometimes both. The problem with them is they have weak roots. They're critical for being there, but they can't withstand another flood event in a month. You know, they'll get washed out. If you want to read a good story about colonizers, in the Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold writes about a riparian area that is painted green. And read about that and see what he's talking about. What painted the creek green? It was a plant. So here are some colonizers. Arrowhead, which is normally a wetland plant, but occasionally shows up in riparian areas. And here's a very common riparian plant called water primrose. Look at these leaves early in the year. Well, first look at this stolon that's running out on the water. It's rooting down and it's spreading, making this plant bigger. And these spoon-shaped leaves laying flat on the water. Now, as we go later in the summer, when water primrose flowers, it has a 5-petal yellow flower. Here's that typical primrose looking seed type. And look at the leaves now. They're long, tapered, and they're keeled or boat-shaped, like a Maximilian sunflower leaves. Here's two colonizers. Well, one colonizer, one colonizer / stabilizer. But giant ragweed has these 3-lobed leaves when they're small and even larger. So that's how you can identify them early. This little green fine leaf stuff that looks like a grass is actually spike rush, Eleochris. And it's a great plant to have right there on the water's edge. Now, stabilizers. These are the stronger, more robust plants, better able to withstand the high energy flows of a follow-up flood. They're strong, fibrous rooted, often rhizomatous, so they're able to send underground roots out to spread and stabilize these areas. Because they are so strong and they're herbaceous and woody, they provide bank protection and dissipate the energy from these floods. So here's Indigo Bush amorpha. Look at it, multi-stemmed. It's kind of skinny stemmed, about the diameter of your little finger, but there's a lot of them and it's well rooted. And it's telling you that it likes to live in the water because that's where it's growing. Here's sycamore, very upright, strong trunk of this stabilizing group of plants here. But also notice the roots are helping to hold the soil. Even though the surface was washed away in a recent flood, those roots are still holding on to some of the soil. And then we have herbaceous plants. This is a strong stabilizing grass called switchgrass, working in conjunction with this colonizer / stabilizer of spike rush. And they're holding that little spot of sediment right there. They're not going to let it wash away. There's 5 wetland indicator categories, and these are described on the bottom of that handout that you can print out. The wettest is the obligate wetland. The driest is the obligate upland. They are exactly opposite. We'll go into the details. Facultative is right in the middle, and we're going to talk about how beneficial it is. So the obligate wetland, often abbreviated to OBL, 99% of the time, these plants will always be in a wetland or riparian area with their roots right in the water, 99% of the time. Now, the next wettest category is the facultative wetland, FACWs, 66 to 99% of the time. So 2/3 to 99% of the time, they're going to be in the riparian area, but up to 1/3 of the time, they may be out on the uplands as well. And then the facultative plants, these are the ones like switchgrass, eastern gamma grass, equally likely to be on high and dry as they are in the wetlands. But that also means these plants can live during the wet periods and they can still survive during the dry periods. They're not going to go away like the facultative obligates will when it gets dry. Now we start getting drier and we're not as concerned about these plants. We're concerned about the facultative, fac wet, and obligate plants because those are the ones that need to be on that creek helping to stabilize it. But the fac upland plants are exactly opposite of the fac wets. 66 to 99% of the time, they're going to be in the non-wetlands in the upland areas. But up to 1/3 of the time, they may be down in the riparian area. And then the driest category is the obligate upland, abbreviated UPL. They are 99% of the time going to be found on the uplands, but 1% of the time they may be down in that riparian area. And Bodark is an example of an obligate upland that seems to me shows up more than 1% of the time in our riparian areas, but that's where it's categorized as a upland plant. Stability ratings also described on that form. Al Windward was a gentleman in Arizona who developed this scale for the plants of Arizona with a riparian plant that had a score of 1 being no better than bare ground, equal to the stability of bare ground. Where a plant that scored a 10 had the strength or stability of anchored rock or large anchored logs. And now we need to have a minimum score when we start looking for plants that we're finding on our creeks. And in the Edwards Plateau, the hill country that has that little steeper slope, they need to have a score of 7 to be able to withstand, keep from being washed out on these higher gradient streams. In the Blackland Prairie or anywhere where you have lower slopes, such as less than 0.3% slope, we can get by with 6s, plants that score a 6. Now we want 7s and 8s as well, but we can get by since our creeks are going a little slower. We can use a little lower rated plant. So let's look at the functional groups of the plants. Here's the colonizer plants. Where do they go to work? They go to work on the moist mud, the recently deposited fresh sediment right down here. And our stabilizers, they're up here on this old flood, or on the floodplain among some older deposits, and they're stabilizing that. If we put the wetland indicator category on them, we see that this down here in the moist mud, that plant's an obligate. This one over here is an obligate. Here's a facultative and a fac wet. Remember I said we want fac wet, and obligate plants on our creek. That's the one that gives us our best stability. We put our names and stability ratings on the plants. We can see black willow up here is a 7. Emery sedge is a 9. And switchgrass is a 9. And this watercress, an introduced grass, but it does work decently well in our creeks, it's scoring a 3 as a weak colonizer. But its job is to get there quick and put some roots down. Here's a colonizer that scores a 4. It's facultative. So frog fruit, we see it on the uplands and pastures, and we see it down on the creeks. And it's attempting to colonize this rock by splitting it apart. And you see the runners that it has. Everywhere there's leaves, there will be roots on this runner. So it will continue to spread, continue to root down. It's putting like a net, just like a badminton net on top of the ground, trying to hold that fresh sediment. Here's spike rush. It's in that transition between a colonizer and a stabilizer. There's different spike rushes, different ones. We're going to say a score of 5 to a 6. It's an obligate, so it wants to have wet roots. Everything you can see in this photo just about is spike rush. Now this little part right here of bare soil, there was a recent high flow event that pushed through this creek and it stripped away that spike rush from right there. But that's okay, that's natural. The plants give and take, and this spike rush will grow back out on this area and recolonize and restabilize this little bar of soil right there. Everything you see behind this hat, this tall grass, is knot grass. And it is a colonizer / stabilizer, scores a 6. It's a fac wet. So 66 to 99% of the time, it's going to have its roots down in the water or near the water. And everything you see in front of this hat is also knot grass. These are the young stolons that are running out on top of this moist mud, trying to increase the patch size of this knot grass. It's going to make a bigger colony of knot grass. Right here is knot grass that is on a new lake up north of Munster. And you see the water table is dropping and the knot grass is following the water. It's growing out, trying to grow to the water. And eventually it'll grow out in the water, and it doesn't hurt the plant. It wants to be out there and it can survive in the water. And when it produces a seed head, it has this old V for victory or a peace sign appearance of the seed head. Broadleaf wood oats, you may have learned this one as inland sea oats. The names change. Botanists do that occasionally. They change a plant name. But it's a colonizer, facultative, so it can take the wetter areas. It can grow in the drier uplands or dry abandoned floodplains, and it scores a 5. This is an excellent grass, a native grass to have if you've got a dense shaded area that you can't grow anything else. You might try some seed of this and see if you can get, and there are native plant sales that have this one in pots you can buy, but you may want to try and grow it in that shade. Down in South Texas, the people call it fish on a pole because of that shape. Here's water willow, grows out in the water predominantly. It'll grow on a moist bank too, but it's a strong stabilizer. It's an obligate, so 99% of the time it's going to be near the water. Scores an 8, and it spreads by underground rhizomes. Cattle will eat this plant in a drought year. When the water goes down, they will come out on this moist mud of the drying up creek, and they'll eat it down to the ground. But here it is up close, beautiful flower, good for pollinators, all around good plant. If you've got a little water garden in your backyard, this would be a good native to have growing there. Here's some of the grasses. Southern wild rice. This is not a wild rice you can eat, but that is its name. It's a strong stabilizer. You can see it growing in the water here in Limestone County in a little creek. It's an obligate, and it scores a 9. Very strong, almost the point of being as strong as anchored rock. Here it is growing in a little slough somewhere on the county line between Ellis and Navarro County. And on either side, I kind of cut it out of the photo, but on either side of this slough, on the top side and the bottom side, is Bermuda grass. You might can see a little of it right here. This slough on either side of it was covered with southern wild rice. And I went down and got my sharpshooter and tried to dig some of this up right here. And that old wet clay was making that sucking sound, and it wasn't going to let me have much. That's all the root I could get. And I cut that plant in half to take a photo of it. So here it is on the tailgate of the pickup. It's not stretched. That's just a cropped photo to cut the top and the bottom of the picture off. So this is about 3.5 feet of the bottom part. The top part, here's the seed head all the way across the bed of the pickup. That's 4 foot. So this grass can get 7.5 feet tall. Scores a 9. Very strong, very stable. But it likes to have sunshine. So it's not going to do us good under the canopy of our blackland creeks that are out under shade. Again, just a reference, southern wild rice on this side, a new grass called rice cutgrass. And it will cut you. If you run your hand down that leaf, it will cut you. But it's a obligate, a little weaker rooted, scores a 5. And this is probably the most common grass you'll see growing out in the creeks in the Edwards Plateau, rice cutgrass. This is probably the best sedge that you can have. It may look like a grass, but this is called emery sedge. You can identify it by these long, bowed over, drooping type leaves. And it's an obligate, strong stabilizer, scores a 9. Here it is on the Brazos River in Palo Pinto County, growing right at the edge of the water, right where it should be. Here it is, that bowed over shape, growing on any of the 35 or so hill country counties. Here it is growing on a restored wetland in Kaufman County. And you can see it still gets that bowed over shape. Here it is on the DFW airport. And I think this is Bear Creek. I might have called it Bull Creek once, but I think it's Bear Creek on the southwest side of DFW airport. Here's emery sedge, but notice the water is way down here, maybe 8 feet down. This creek, because of all the construction, all the runoff around it, that southwest part of the airport, it has a tremendous amount of water being pushed down this creek, and it's down cutting and widening now. So this photo is 5 to 7 years old. If you could go back to that spot right now, this clump of emery sedge would probably be dead because the water's too far down. But hopefully there'll be younger emery sedge plants growing down here. And here it is in a 70-year-old photograph, a slide that I scanned from Bell County, from some family album. We did a riparian workshop for the village of Salado several years ago, and some of the residents gave me some old photos that we wanted to use to demonstrate what the creek used to look like and what its potential was. And right down here, we can see emery sedge. We can also see Johnson grass. It was here then. It's been here since 1823. Here's water willow and black willow and some grapevine. And here we are back to the Brazos River in Palo Pinto County. This is the Highway 16 bridge, about a mile or mile and a half below the dam. This old bridge was built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. But look at this patch of emery sedge right here. Pretty healthy. I put a couple of arrows here just to give you points that you might want to look at. Now, this is in May of 2008. And let's go forward to November of 2008. That point still there? Yeah. Not much different. But what happened in between is that there was a major flood, July of 2008. And water was flowing 6 foot deep for about 5 weeks through this, under the bridge. They had all but one of the gates open on the PK Dam. And now let's go back and look before the flood event, after the flood event. Look at all the bushes up here pushed over, leaning because of the water going this way. But it's still there. Now, I went back in 2019 and took that same photo again. But if you remember, we had major floods in 2015, 2016, even some in 2017 that have contributed to washing out a good part of this. Look at this little pipe right here. You see it? And right there, it still is. But a good bit of this emery sedge was washed out. But switchgrass, another with a score of 9, is coming in there and trying to help it out, trying to hold it. Let's go across the bridge now. We're going to come over here. Before the flood, look at the emery sedge on the side. There's recent flood events, minor floods, where they have a little sediment deposited. And now let's look at it after the flood. And you can see a little bit more emery sedge once the leaves fall off these hackberries. And all this grass back here is switchgrass. So this is all in this new floodplain that's down low. There's probably other floodplains up higher that flood in the really big events. But let's talk about switchgrass. It's a strong stabilizer with a score of 9. It's a facultative plant, so it can take being right in the water like this, or it can grow up here in a prairie in Haskell County in the rolling plains on a very dry site. And it's equally happy. Now, this grass, eastern gamma grass, is the most palatable grass that a cow will ever wrap its tongue around. It's a native grass, but it's been grazed out of most of the pastures. Facultative, so it can take being near the water and it can take the dryness, and it scores a 9. Now, here's a neat thing. If you've got a creek that you feel might be in a little bit of danger right now, a little bit eroded, you can buy the seed of switchgrass and eastern gamma grass. If you want switchgrass, ask for Alamo switchgrass. There's 2 varieties, Alamo and Blackwell. Alamo is the bottomland switchgrass, and eastern gamma grass, they'll have a variety for you there. And you can get that at a feed store. You can call Turner Seed Company in Breckenridge. You can order it from them and hand scatter these seeds right now out on this moist mud. These plants are starting to germinate and grow, so now's the time to get it in before it gets to be 100 degrees in May. Eastern Gamma has male and female plant parts on the same stem. Here's the male flowers right out here, and the female embryo or ovaries, I guess, are right here. And they turn green when they're immature, and then when they're mature, they turn this straw color, and they will break away. And they float down and get reestablished on another part of the creek. We've got 2 native wild ryes, not ryegrass, but wild ryes, Canada wild rye and Virginia wild rye. They're both facultative. One scores a 5, one a 6. Good ones to have. Get into some of the woody plants. Here's black willow, relatively short-lived in the tree world, maybe 75 years, and then they're going to die out. But in that 75 years, there'll be other trees, hopefully some oaks, that will come in and be filling in and overtopping these willows. But it's a stabilizer. All of these are going to be stabilizers. Fac wet scores a 7. Here is cottonwood, also fac wet, scores a 6. Sycamore. Now, this is one you could plant in your yard up well away from the creek, or it'll grow right down in the creek because it's a facultative with a score of 6. Bur oak. This gentleman right here, see him standing about 6 foot tall. That's a pretty good sized bur oak right there. This is right on the county line between Ellis County and Navarre County, about a half a mile from Mill Creek. And you know the leaves, bigger, a foot long, way bigger than your hand, golf ball size acorns, scores of 6. Here are some seedling bur oaks on the DFW airport grounds on that creek, on the bank of that creek. Here's button bush. It's an obligate, likes to be in the water. Scores of 7. Now, if you ever see button bush up on a hillside in an upland, don't drive over to it because it's probably on a perched water table, either a rock layer or heavy clay layer holding water shallow enough for this plant to grow in, and you'll probably get stuck in it. And the button bush is also a good pollinator, flowers pretty long time during the summer. Box elder maple, may just call it box elder, is a fact wet, scores of 6. Here's the leaves begin to get a little droopy look to them. And sometimes you might think that it's poison ivy, but this will always be a tree. If you trace it back, it's going to go to a limb and to a trunk. Poison ivy will always go back to a vine. Green ash, also fact wet, scores of 6. Rough leaf dogwood, facultative, scores of 6. Here's the flowers and the white fruit. One of the few woody plants we have in Texas that produces a white fruit. American beautyberry, facultative upland, the driest category, or next to the driest, scores of 4. The stems are just not very big enough to really give it much support. And then here's the upland category, the driest one. Osage orange, Bodark, horseapple, whatever you want to call it, scores of 6. And look at the browse line. How does the browse line get developed? Browsing animals. Now let's go through a 30-year history of a creek up in Oregon, because it's a long way from us, but what happened up there applies to Texas as well. And this gentleman in the photo took these photos. His name's Wayne Elmore. He's retired now from the National Riparian Service Team, which had a team built up, a multidisciplinary team. They had plant specialist, range specialist, fluvial geomorphologist, botanist, and they all worked together to stabilize and evaluate these creeks. And he was based out of Oregon. This Bear Creek is in central Oregon, 3,500 foot elevation on the dry side, away from the ocean, 12-inch precipitation, so it's dry country, even though it's in Oregon. Here's the creek. Now, to set the story up, you got to know that back in the 1950s, there was a species of willow, not black willow like we have, but another species of willow growing much like our black willow up and down the creeks, getting thick. In the 1950s, well before wildlife was popular as a management and well before pollinators were popular, it was all about cattle and it was all about cowgrass, growing more grass. Now, this land is owned by the BLM. It never was homesteaded. It never was purchased. The U.S. government, Bureau of Land Management, owns it, and it was leased out for over 100 years to different permittees that had permits to graze. So it's been grazed for over 100 years. So it was all about the cowgrass in the 1950s. So in the late 50s, they sprayed miles and miles and miles in Oregon and Washington, controlling these willows. Then in 1964, a 100-year flood event came across that area, came across Bear Creek here, and those trees that had been holding the bank, those willows, they were dead now. Their roots had shriveled up, and when the floodwaters came through, it just pulled those trees loose from the bank. It eroded, it downcut, it widened, and it was a mess. Now, this photo is from 1977. The flood happened 13 years prior, and the creek still has not made much recovery. But here's where we are. We got a rock bottom in part of it. Here's a little trickle of water. This used to be a blue ribbon trout stream, but it hasn't been since the 50s. This cut bank right here, starting to get a little bit of layback. Vegetation cannot grow on a vertical bank, but it can grow on a 45-degree slope. So now I want to call your attention to a couple of trees. This tree right here that I always thought had a hula hoop around it, Wayne Elmore just called it the fat tree. We're going to look at that tree and we're going to look at this snag. They'll be in every photo. Now, all of these junipers right here in the front, including these couple of big ones, they're going to be gone in the next photo. So someone came in and cut them down. And this is sand sagebrush right here. This is upland. And also, as we go through these photos, watch and look at the grass response up here on the mountain. This was a large pasture. They were evaluating a 3.5 mile stretch of Bear Creek, and they called it a reach. So this was all in one pasture, huge pastures, 30, 40, 50,000 acre pastures, not unusual. So there were no fish in it. It was down to intermittent flow, had accelerated erosion, lots of sediment loss. I mentioned the poor grazing, which is equaling poor vegetation. The riparian sponge area amounted to about 4 acres in a mile. So you take 4 football fields and stretch them the length of a mile, and that's all the riparian sponge there was. Water storage amounted to 1.5 acre feet per mile. This 3.5 mile reach was about 18,000 feet, and they still had serious bank erosion happening on 2/3 of the length of this reach, over 12,000 feet. So what did they do? They figured out that grazing was the problem, excessive grazing on leased land. Now, from 1977 to 79, they told the permittee, you've got to take your cows off, no grazing at all. He was probably upset. Most people would be, but he was probably only paying 5 cents, 7 cents, 9 cents an acre for this land back then in the 70s. But he was willing to go along with it. So for 2 years, they took the cows off. From 79 to 84, the government, BLM, said, all right, you can go back now, pardon me, with some grazing, but it needs to be at a reduced stocking rate. We're trying to jumpstart recovery of the vegetation. And then from 1985 through the present, it's been operated as part of a rotational grazing system. So they move the cattle pasture to pasture, different months of the year, and they graze this reach of Bear Creek in late winter. So it has all spring, summer, and fall to grow vegetation. So there's where we are. Here's the creek in 83. Is that the same location? Well, there's the hula hoop tree and there's the snag. So that's the right location. Look at the cut bank. It's getting smaller. It's getting more laid back with sediment deposits. We got sediment deposited over here on the right, and we've got vegetation growing. But what is this in the middle? Water. It's flowing water again. From 77 to 83, that change in reducing the grazing has helped to restore the water flow. Here we are in 86. There's a tree. Notice we're going to start seeing something happen now. The riparian area is widening. So this area right here is the floodplain. This is upland where the sagebrush is. So the riparian sponge is widening and it's narrowing the creek channel. So 86, June of 87, they had a flood event. Wasn't a major flood, but it did create some fresh sediment deposited. You can see footprints where they walked out here looking at it. Did that destroy everything that we spent 10 years building? Let's go forward from June to August of 87. No. Riparian vegetation is designed, or it's just in their DNA, to accept floods, accept that sediment, and grow through it. So to a creek, a flood is a good thing. A flood brings down sediment, it brings vegetation, and helps to get a healthier creek. We go forward now, another year. Notice the creek is narrowing up again. Riparian area is getting wider. Have you looked up here? Not a lot of difference in the vegetation up here. Now here, the 88 or so is when that permittee was allowed to come back in with more cattle. And notice he was probably happy seeing this amount of vegetation down here because he's not growing much more up here. But what happened in 93? There's the hula hoop tree, there's the snag. I'm going to show you a new tree right here, this little pyramid shaped tree. But look at, here's our creek right here. 93 was a drought year. And what happens when the water dries up in a creek? The last bit of water is in the middle of the channel, and the plant roots try to grow under that channel, forming a netting under the channel to help it prevent cutting down anymore. So to a creek, a drought is a good thing because it stabilizes the creek bank, the channel. February of 96, they estimated this to be a 75-year flood event. They were out there in a different time of the day. The hula hoop tree's over here. You can't hardly see it for the shadows. There's the snag, and there's that pyramid-shaped tree I said to look for. And now the water's well above the floodplain. It's out here on the uplands. Here's crested wheatgrass, which they said only grows in the uplands, and water's all around it. February of 96, go forward to April. They had to move the photo point. Notice we're further away from the tree and the snag. They had to move the photo point back to explain why the creek widened out. It widened out because beavers had moved in and tried to dam it up. It's become that stable of a creek that the beavers returned. But look at the vegetation. Healthy as all get out. No problems at all. October of 96, about the time the cows would come in, turned into this pasture, looks pretty good. Not a lot of issues. It's got good stability. 2001, another drought, but that's all right. This creek has been through droughts before, and it's going to weather this storm. Look how green the riparian area is. This is sedges and rushes and riparian grasses that are adapted to being in that wet, and they can take a little bit of dry too. There's a hula hoop tree, 2007, 30 years. And I want to say that no diesel smoke was expended in the correction of this creek. What healed this creek was removing a hindrance, a problem, and grazing. Excessive grazing was the problem. And that removing that hindrance, adapting it to a planned grazing with a reduced stocking rate, fixed the creek. Now let's look at a cross section of Bear Creek. Here's the view back in 77 when it had that steep cut bank. Here's just the bare ground basically on the bottom. And here's the view on the right-hand side. Right here is the 83 look when it had that water about 6 or 8 foot wide. And then here is the look in 2001, drought year. Notice that the creek has narrowed up to become more efficient. It didn't have to be wide anymore. It could be narrow and still carry water and sediment. Something else that's pretty amazing, look at what it's done. The elevation of that rock bottom was at 88 feet, and now it has moved up to 90 feet. So it has added 2 feet of sediment under the bottom of the channel. And that channel is very stable. So 10 years of management kicked it off. 20 more years just made it better. A couple more examples. Here's Muddy Creek. Look at this bald knob right here. Look how wide the channel is. Here's a row of plum bushes back here. If we go forward about 11 years, bald knob is haired over. The creek narrowed up and became well vegetated. A hindrance was removed. Here's another one in Colorado. This rock right here is somewhere right up in here, and you have to look for it because look back in 76. The creek was flowing, but it was narrow, it was wide and shallow. Not a lot of vegetation either. Look at it here in 78. It's narrowed up. We've got sediment deposited, vegetation growing on the sediment. There's that same rock. And now, 10 years, 11 years later, got quite a bit of riparian vegetation. So that creek is very stable now. Let's now sum it up with some of these hindrances to riparian function. What are the hindrances? Farming, mowing, or spraying weeds too close to the bank of a creek. I'm standing on a paved road. To the right of me, half a mile would be a party barn pavilion that has a skeet and trap range, horseshoes, washer pitching, barbecue pits. It's a party area that the landowner's proud of. And the landowner has the hired hands come down here and mow this area to make it look pretty. But they're mowing really too close to the creek. They're putting a hindrance on the health of this creek. See the deer feeder? See the fence down here? The same landowner owns the land on the other side of the creek. Look at the vegetation back here. That's what the potential of this creek is, to look like that. But because of chainsaws and lawnmowers, it's changed to this and putting it at a hindrance. So we sometimes farm, mow, or spray weeds too close to the banks. Grazing concentrations in the creeks. This is never good when it looks like this. You don't want to have excessive grazing down to the roots of the trees. This is Salado Creek, a lighter stocking rate, and still the creek can be healthy. I'm not saying take cows completely away. We just got to be a better manager, better steward of the land. Excessive populations of deer, exotic deer, or feral hogs in creek areas is a hindrance to the health of that creek. I originally stopped to take a picture of this high fence. It was laid over by a recent flood, and I guess these axis deer were laying down because I didn't see them when I drove by first. When I turned around and came back and stopped, they were standing up. But these animals concentrate in the riparian areas. They spend a disproportionate amount of time in riparian areas. The water's there, the shade's there, and good vegetation to eat is there, but that can be a hindrance. Manicured landscapes next to the creek, Frio River and the Edwards Plateau, they have bald cypress, which are nice riparian trees, but there are no young or middle-aged bald cypress. They're all the same age. And they're not going to let logs and mud lay up here on this nice mowed grass. If this is 100 feet in a mile of the Frio River, that's not going to be a problem. But if everybody that on these narrow sections of land where they have acreage that runs down to the creek, if everybody does this, it can put the creek in peril. So that can be a hindrance. Artificial manipulation of the banks, removal of sediment from the creek is a definite problem. If you change the banks, you're changing the way the water flows. This is Salado Creek down in Bell County. If you've driven down through Interstate 35, down through Temple and on south, you went right through Salado. This is the golf course in Salado. And I joke about this guy on the front end loader's got the most stable job in the county, because every time it rains, a big rain, the golf course manager calls him, says, come get this gravel out of the creek. It looks ugly. But what caused the gravel to be there is, look how wide the creek is. Down below to the left of where I took this photo, there's a golf cart trail that goes across Salado Creek, and they put 4 tin horns, 24-inch diameter culverts across there, thinking that that would let the water flow through. But when you slow that much water down, when it hits those tin horns, it drops sediment. And the guy gets a phone call the next time it rains and says, come get this gravel. Now something happened. I was by there a few months later, and I noticed this sign. Texas Parks and Wildlife has approved removal of rocks. Well, the village of Salado was fined by Texas Parks and Wildlife for removing sand, gravel, or marl from a public river without a permit. And their sign now says they've got a permit. But artificial manipulation of the banks is never a good thing. Excessive vehicle traffic in the creek areas. Prior to 2007, when the state of Texas passed a law forbidding the driving of motorized vehicles in riparian areas of public waters of the state of Texas, people would get their 4-wheel drives. These Jeep clubs would organize big field days, and they would drive up and down the creeks and tear up everything, tear up the vegetation. Those big mud grip tires churning would dislodge the vegetation. You always had leakage of gear oil, transmission fluid, radiator fluid, brake fluid, something leaking in. But since 2007, it's not legal to do this. So that removed the hindrance of these vehicles. Removal of large dead wood and down trees in a creek. Notice right here and right here, a tree trunk's been chainsawed off. That's not a good thing, because these creeks will incorporate these trees, these logs, into the sediment. And much like putting rebar in concrete, the creek is putting I-beams instead of rebar down into the sediment. and it's making that bank a lot more stable. If your house is right above this, you can cut a few of them out. That's all right, but don't cut it all the way up and down. This is the San Antonio River, southeast of San Antonio. This photo came off the internet. I don't know where it is, but it reinforces what the quote here is. Excessive recreational foot traffic in creek areas can be a hindrance. We can love a creek to death. And what happens is we beat down the vegetation right here, and that's going to have to happen because we need access to recreation, outdoor, being part of nature. But these cattails on either side sort of limit where people can go. So you're making access in certain spots, but limiting access in others. Excessive alluvial pumping of water out of a creek is bad. Now, somebody might have a land against the Brazos River. They drill a well right beside it. They put a 200 horsepower pump, and it's powered with a big V8 truck engine. They can pump a lot of water out of that well, which is actually pumping water out of the Brazos River since you're in the floodplain. And when that happens, these plants dry up. This is switchgrass that has a yellowish green color, and the spikerush has a yellowish green color. They're being stressed because of a lack of water. So excessive pumping can be a hindrance. Poorly designed bridges and road crossings can be a hindrance. This was a photo taken by a fellow I worked with, Kenneth Mabin, in the somewhere in DFW area. A new subdivision was built. Here's the creek running behind the subdivision. And the story is that they needed a new road to go out the back of this subdivision. So the engineers had to design a bridge that would carry a 100-year flood. And they built this, 6 boxes to let that creek go through. But notice the shape of this original creek. It's deep, sort of trapezoidal shape. When the creek realized the bridge was there, what it did, it said, I can't spread out that wide. So I'm going to pick one box and I'm going to make that my channel, just like it had here. And it starts filling in all these other boxes with excess sediment. And here's the downstream side, that one channel coming through. But all the boxes, other boxes are getting filled up with sediment. So that creates a problem, kind of like at Salado. You got to clean out the boxes. What would have been better is if the engineers had designed a huge box right here, the same size as the channel, and had smaller boxes on top of it. And to the creek then, that bridge would have been invisible and there wouldn't have been any problems. But we've got to learn how to build better bridges and crossings across these creeks. And then prescribed burning or wildfires in a riparian area can be a bad thing. This is in Palo Pinto County from the April of 2011 wildfires. I took this photo in August of 2011. The button bush, the switchgrass, the water willow has been burnt down. You know, that button bush might have been 6 feet tall, but in August of 2011, that's how tall it was. I went back and found this old photo I'd taken 5 years later, and it's not that much better. Here's the switchgrass, and the water willow is looking pretty good, but the button bush is still struggling. Introducing invasive plants into a creek. One landowner on Salado Creek planted elephant ears. And I've watched for it downstream, and for about 1.5 miles down, which is as far as I could get on a public road, I could find young plants of elephant ear growing. Terrible problem. We also have a problem with giant cane, Arundo donax, growing on our riparian areas. Cattle will eat this plant, but most of the time we don't have cattle on all the creeks where giant cane grows. So to sum it all up, the creeks can heal themselves if we get out of the way, remove the hindrance, and give them time and better management. That's the removing the hindrance part. So here's my email if anyone needs it or wants it. I noticed, or I thought about it today after I sent that riparian plant list, that it probably still has my old email, but this is my current email. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Cindy. Or anyone there that wants to.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Ricky. That was awesome. I know we learned a lot. If anybody needs that handout, I'm posting it back in chat just in case you missed it. We have one question so far from Rachel. She wants to know, how does effect of the invasive wildlife
Back up.
compare?
Say again?
How does effect of the invasive wildlife compare with the effect of overpopulation of white-tailed deer?
Well, we've got a lot of deer in Texas. I think 4 to 5 million white-tailed deer, but they're spread out over the entire state. Where the exotic deer are the most common is the Edwards Plateau, Kerrville, Fredericksburg in particular. And they go into the town at night and sleep and eat flower beds. So they're probably, in certain areas of the state, the exotics are way worse than the whitetails, are worse than livestock grazing. But in the rest of the Texas, where we don't have as many exotics, when you put native white-tailed deer and sheep and goats and excessive numbers of sheep, goats, and cattle, that's just as bad as having too many exotics in those small areas. So it's a bad problem. I don't know that whitetails on their own are going to cause enough harm, but it's whitetail in combination with excessive numbers of livestock that can cause a problem.
All right. Someone would like to know how they can get rid of cattail. It's currently choking out their pond.
Well, we can use that same analogy. If you remove the hindrance, cattails will go away. The hindrance is in that pond, shallow water. It's probably got 4 feet of depth or less. I would nearly guarantee it where the cattails are growing, it's shallower than 4 feet. So if you could go in and deepen the pond, clean it out with bulldozers, some type of track hose, things like that with buckets, and clean it out and deepen the shoreline, you can actually get rid of the cattails without using chemicals. The cattail has an underground root that has to get sunlight shining on it in the spring for it to initiate growth. If you deepen the water deeper than 4 feet, the cattail can't get, even if there is a rhizome 4 feet down, it can't get enough sunlight to germinate. So that's the organic way of getting rid of cattails, deepen the pond. The chemical way would be to use a Roundup product called Rodeo. It's an aquatic labeled Roundup, basically 41% active ingredient. You can spray it on the cattails when they're actively growing, spray it right on the water. I mean, if there's water there, it doesn't hurt. It deactivates when it hits the water or the soil, but it will kill green vegetation that it comes in contact with. If you've got issues with a pond that you think you might want to have it cleaned out, you can contact the Natural Resources Conservation Service in your county. They're in every county in the state, and they've got specialists. It doesn't cost you anything. They'll come out and look at the pond and maybe give you some cost estimates of what it might take to repair it. They don't do the work. They don't hire it out. You hire it out, but they can act like a third person, uninterested third party, basically, to try to steer you towards some good contractors and hopefully get a good job done. Now, sometimes you can use that old pond as a silt trap and drop down below that pond if you have room and still have good soil material, and build a new pond and let that old one stay there catching silt, and build your new pond below it and build it correctly with 4-to-1 side slopes so it won't have the issue of cattails growing on it.
Well, I tell you what, we got a lot of questions coming in now. You got them rolling.
All right.
Would you manage an ephemeral creek any different?
Well, any creek needs good management, good grazing management, but you wouldn't expect an ephemeral creek to have the riparian, you wouldn't expect any obligate plants and only a few facultative wet plants, because the creek does not have contact with a water table. It's a dry weather creek, basically, or a wet weather creek, dry most of the time. But you still need to manage it, because otherwise in a flash flood type, you can get erosion. So the creek can degrade, but you probably you'll just have the same kind of grasses mostly that you have on the uplands growing right down to the edge and right across the dry channel of the creek.
You said that cattle eat the arundo cane. I've never heard of this. Can cattle control this invasive? Has it been tried along the invaded areas like the Rio Grande?
Well, they probably don't try it down there because they don't want the cattle getting across into Mexico where the, what is that tick, the fever tick, still active. But cattle will eat it. And if you, as you drive around, if you notice where you see giant cane, look first and see if there's a fence. If it's not fenced, it's not going to be grazed. If it is fenced, look and see if there's any cattle. They will eat it. But most of the time, it's either growing down in the bank away from where the cattle can get to, or it's growing in a place where there's not any cattle. But cattle certainly eat it.
Tim says, in early slides, you showed just grass covering along the stream and erosion increased. Why does the Corps of Engineers always argue for no riparian wood dense vegetation along streams and only grass covering?
Well, on the upper reaches, the headwaters of a creek, you have less amount of water coming in. And normally those creeks can get by with just herbaceous vegetation, grassy type vegetation. But as you get further down the creek, more runoff, more watershed area, you need trees. Was he saying that the Corps doesn't want the trees?
Yeah.
Well, they probably
Talking
don't
about the Trinity?
Yeah.
They probably don't want the trees growing on man-made berms or man-shaped creek banks, because in a way, let's take willows, black willow. If you let black willows grow on a tank dam is a dam type pond, and the tree dies, those roots shrink and it can make a pipeline between the soil and the shrunken tree root that water can get by. And so it creates seepage through that tank dam. They may want it to where they can mow. I don't know. They probably have some issue, some reason, but it's not for the health of the creek reason. It's probably a maintenance issue.
Yeah, they maintain any kind of wooded vegetation is erosional more than anything else.
No.
They don't want any trees growing in their in between levees.
If you look at that plant list, the stronger rooted plants are going to be in that tree category. The grasses and sedges, they drop down, the 3s and 4s, but there's very few woody plants less than a 4 or 5. They are very stable, well-rooted, strong, upright trunks, able to withstand flooding.
Yeah, we just always argued with them about that. That's all.
Are there examples of concrete sided channels that can become more natural via introduction of plants, sediment, etc.?
I haven't seen any. Now, the DFW airport, if you look on Google Earth, there are some concrete sloped banks, and all that's growing in the bottom will be usually cattails, because they've got a blockage, and they're in water that's stagnant is where cattails can grow. Cattails rarely grow where water flows. It's in stagnant water, ponds, and in areas where a creek is backed up that cattail can grow. But you don't have anywhere for the vegetation to grow on the concrete banks. So those are usually designed to just be transporting the water out. They're not worried about the riparian health. They're just trying to get rid of the water. Same way when they put a construction and build a subdivision and they bring in that 4 and 5, 6 foot diameter pipe and bury it to try to capture all the runoff that used to flow through the creek. And they put the pipe under the ground so that the creek is no longer there, but it's trying to flow that water through that pipe.
I think we have our last question for the evening. Lots of people saying thank you very much, great presentation. But our last question is, our bank is approximately 14 feet tall. Angle of the water is eroding and destabilizing. Is there anyone that we can call to help with this problem?
Is it in a rural area or urban area or?
Kim,
Well,
is it?
it's not going to matter other than there's really no one that wants to help.
She says rural.
It's just like in the slides. You got to let it go through that widening. Now you can try to plant switchgrass, eastern gamagrass seeds. You can put maybe a little late this year, but during the wintertime, you can go out and cut black willow stakes. And think about a big, heavy hoe handle. You want a willow limb that's about the diameter, 1.5 or 2 inch diameter, 5-6 feet long. And you're going to cut those in the wintertime and then take them and put them right at the water's edge. You're going to drive them in, maybe use a T-post driver. And you want to, if they're 6 foot long, you want to put 4 to 4.5 feet of them, 5 feet maybe, into the ground and leave a foot and a half sticking out. And they will take root and grow. They'll send up limbs and leaves and they will grow. Anytime you can get stabilizing vegetation on those side banks. Now, a bank that's like this, it's going to be hard to get anything to grow on it. It's going to have to lay back to about a 45-degree angle, and then vegetation can take root. So
planting switchgrass at the top of that steep slope isn't really going to help much. It'll probably erode before it reaches, right?
It'll make you feel better, but if it's still widening, it's not gonna stop it. But it will make you feel better.
And make your pocketbook more empty.
Well, it's not real expensive for the switchgrass seed. I don't remember what it is a pound, but you're not putting a whole lot of it out when you just hand scattering it. Like feeding chickens, you're not throwing a lot of seed out.
Gotcha. Well, that's all we had for you today. Thank you so much, Ricky. This was awesome. We learned a lot every time we watch it. Even though there's some repeating elements from your talks, we always learn something new.
And something that you might want to check into, the Texas AgriLife Extension has got some riparian workshops that they put on. There's going to be one April the 20th at Joe Pool Lake. I have not found a link to that yet. I'm going to be one of the ones there presenting, or it's by Zoom, but it's a 3-hour, a more expanded version of what you just had. And then we do a virtual creek walk in the afternoon with some slides I've taken of different creeks all across the state. And you'll get a little better every time you hear this. I hit you with a whole lot tonight. I hit you with it fast. And every time you hear this, a little bit more soaks in and sinks in. So I would encourage you trying to get a hold of the county agent, find out where that link is that you can sign up. There'll be one April 20th at Joe Pool Lake. There'll be a couple more down in South and South Central Texas later in the year. I don't know the dates and locations on those yet.
Carol Feldman said she got the link in her inbox today. Carol, okay. Do you have time to grab it and paste it?
I'm looking. I'm not sure. It's going to take me a little bit, but I did get it today, and I earmarked it. But I'm not on the same computer as my email is, so I'd have to.
Well, share it with me, and I can post to Facebook, and I can put it in April's newsletter.
I will do that. I will send it to you.
Well, just keep watching the creeks, walk the creeks, look at the plants, take that checklist with you, start learning these plants. The plants are talking to you. If they're growing out there in the water, they're saying, this is where I need to be. So that's going to be an obligate or a fact wet plant. So learn these plants.
Thank you, Ricky.
Well, appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone, and hope you have a great spring week.
Thank you.